Okay, so let's move on to why we're here. Today's session on managing multiple projects for policy authoring and deployment. Our speaker today is Srijit Nair, who's our product manager here at Axiomatics. He's responsible for the vision, planning, and design around the core products of Axiomatics. He brings great knowledge to our team, including an understanding of security issues related to virtualization and the cloud-based delivery model. He's done advanced studies on information flow control, policy enforcement, applied cryptography, and general system security. So with that, I'll turn it over to Srijit to get us started.
Thank you very much, Kelly. Thanks for your nice introduction. And I like that picture of yours that you gave me when I asked you for a profile picture to put on the slides.
Yes,
it just makes the day.
My very professional picture of my dog and the Easter Bunny. Yes.
Once again, as Kelly mentioned, the main focus behind this webinar is to give an idea of the multi-project capability that we have introduced in the latest version of our product. But before I do that, I'll just set the agenda for the webinar and the flow of the discussion and the description of what the problem is and how we solve it. It starts with a simple introduction to ABAC and externalized authorization, as most of our webinars do, just because it lays the foundation behind most of the works that we do within Axiomatics and most of the products, the focus point behind most of the products that we have. After that, we go to the main crux of the problem. Associated with the Axiomatics policy server, what the product does, the features, and why is it that we are looking at the multi-project functionality. After that, I will take you through a quick demo of what that actually means, the multi-project functionality, what can you expect, and last but not the least, as Kelly mentioned, we will be answering the questions and answers that you are more than welcome to provide while the whole webinar is being done using the chat and Q&A tool that you have in the GoToMeeting webinar panel tool. So quick intro of ABAC and externalized authorization. This is a slide that we often use in our webinars and when we talk to customers and prospects, especially those who are on the fence between moving from an old role-based access control mode to what we call the attribute-based access control mode. Gartner, one of the consultants and one of the research analysts predict rather, in that by 2020, 70% of enterprises will be using ABAC, which stands for Attribute-Based Access Control, as a dominant mechanism to protect critical assets, up from less than 5% today. And that's a pretty big jump. So they predicted that in 2014. So in about 6 years rather, you're going to have a jump from 5% to 70%. And we are actually seeing that on the ground. A lot of big companies are moving from RBAC to ABAC, which means a fundamental shift in how you think about the problem, how we frame the problem, and how we solve the problem. And that's where Axiomatics comes into place, because what we see is that sensitive business critical information needs to be granted or denied access based on different kinds of attributes of different people and personas involved in the equation. It boils down to the following attributes around what, who, what, when, where, why, and how. And what that means is basically the who can access information, what kind of information can they access when, as in what conditions around the time, around other attributes, where can they access the information from, for example, whether they can access information from mobile devices or outside the network or through a VPN and so on, how, from which device, the APIs they can access the information from, why, for what reason. So there might be a need to know policy, so there must be very specific requirements as to why somebody can actually access that information. So all those boils down to, of course, to the drivers for the move towards ABAC. The primary being the limitations on RBAC, and that's mostly seen from companies and institutions that move from the old way of working, what they have been doing for a couple of years or more, when they have hit the limitations on RBAC, and the fact that they really cannot scale to the level they want, they cannot express the complexity of some of these policies using just roles, permissions, and mappings between user roles and permissions and actions, for example. And of course, there is also the need for decoupling of logic of application from the business logic. And we are seeing this a lot more prevalent in the demand we see in the market now. People are realizing that it's a huge task to maintain access control logic within the business logic of applications. That they want to separate them out, externalize it, decouple it so that they can maintain each one of them having lifecycle independent of each other. And that, again, brings us to the maintenance overhead associated with combining them and keeping them separate. Complexity of authorization policies. Again, the fact that policies becomes more complex becomes a driver for using more fine-grained access control mechanisms. So think compliance, think regulation, think audit, think a lot of different channels for accessing information, multitude of channels, and the fact that you can now have policy-driven centralized access control, which means you can actually use simple central places to control access to all the different policies you have. You can express complex rules and kind of group them using policies, make everything driven using policies rather than ad hoc scripting languages, ad hoc SQL scripts, SQL schemas, and so on that provide access control at the database layer, for example. So the ABAC shift then basically moves from the RBAC to an attribute-based access control model. So it's a move from coarse-grained mechanisms to a fine-grained mechanisms, and from the concept of mapping users to one role, and then you mapping roles to those permissions and mapping permissions to certain actions that's allowed to that permissions. From that, you move to many attributes per user or resources, and everything gets expressed as part of the attributes as a concept associated with attributes. So you write your policies using attributes notions, you request certain actions using attributes, so you describe your situation using attributes, and then the access control policies kick in and you get a permit or a yes or a no answer. So with that in mind, if you look at the typical architecture you would expect from ABAC, attribute-based access control deployment model, you typically see a user or a system that represents the user trying to access certain data, certain applications, certain information, that's just, or resource to give a generic name to it. And typically when somebody says can user access record hash 22 or something like that, what happens then is that there is an kind of a interception point somewhere that the flow of that access control, that access request actually get intercepted, and it sends off a request to evaluation or a authorization service asking whether this certain entity or user can do that action that's being requested. At that point, the authorization service kicks up all the backend processes that's required to evaluate that request. The foremost among them, of course, is looking at the policies that's built into the authorization service or deployed to the authorization service. For example, here what you're saying is that there is a policy which says permit managers to do certain action provided that certain conditions are met. For example, if this certain conditions, or that unless certain other conditions are not met, things like that. So the authorization service then starts to evaluate these policies, or policy rules, of course, and also looks up extra information from what we call the attribute sources. So there are different sources of these attribute values, for example, LDAP directories, Active Directories, maybe SQL services, or even web services actually, that could provide values associated with certain attributes. For example, here the user could be identified just by user ID, while the rule could have been written based on expressed as a part of the role of a person. So the mapping between the user to the role, for example, can be provided with the Active Directory attribute source. So that kicks in, and at the end of it, you get a permit or a deny. And that's what the interception point will then act on and either permits the access or denies the access. And of course, the interception point is what is provided as the green symbol over here. And to make the whole concept of ABAC prevalent and secure, you of course need to have the defense in depth or the any depth architecture as well, because what we are kind of proposing in this picture is that you can basically run the same set of authorization policies at different levels within the web application or any other application tier, the software stack as a whole. You could do it at the single sign-on tier, the web level, the presentation tier, the web app or the web services tier, and all the way down to the database tier. So you can do a whole lot of these access control, access governance at that different places within the software stack. And this whole concept of authorization engine and the whole surrounding scaffolding around the authorization engine is what our core product Axiomatics Policy Server provides you with. So the Axiomatics Policy Server has few great key capabilities that makes it kind of a unique product in the market. It provides, of course, the fine-grained externalized authorization, protecting access based on any kind of criteria that you can write based on attribute-based access control model. It is technology neutral in the sense that you don't have to write your applications in Java, .NET, or any other specific language or any specific technology, because the API, the way you can call out to this authorization service, it's based on web services calls. It's exposed as a service, so you can consume them irrespective of what the client is actually implemented in. And then, of course, you can write, you have SDKs that Axiomatics provides that helps you write these integration points as well. Axiomatics Policy Server is enterprise ready, by which we mean that it provides a it's withstood the test of high performance requirements, high availability requirements, and we have also recently introduced a rich business-oriented policy editor, which makes it pretty, I think, intuitive to write ABAC policies, even though it can get complex. There is an abstraction there that you can kind of vision, give you a vision of what that policy's modeling looks like and how you would want to expand on those policies at the later stage. And of course, it is based on the XACML 3.0 standards, which means that everything that we do around Axiomatics Policy Server is standard-based, forward-thinking, and kind of future-proof in a way. And as we've seen in the previous slide, we can have attributes from a lot of different sources, LDAP directories, Active Directories, databases, and so on. So if you look at the architecture, and pardon the initial set of kind of generic slides, but it's good to understand where we are coming from a very high framework point of view towards distilling into the product and what's so unique about the product and the feature we are going to discuss. So if you look at the policy, Axiomatics Policy Server, there are a couple of moving components. Of course, there is the evaluation engine that is core to the actual process of evaluating the policies and understanding what needs to be done when an access request is received. But equally important is the components which are used to kind of manage these policy decision points, or what we call the policy decision points, which is in layman's term the evaluations engine, and also the policy writing capability that's provided, because without intuitive tools for writing policies, managing these PDPs and other configurations, it becomes really hard to use any tool which can get complex in no time. So if you look at the architecture, it's relatively complicated, but it becomes easier from a webinar point of view if you just completely ignore those things on the right-hand side, because the focus of this webinar is purely on the things that's on the left-hand side, on the component we call the Axiomatics Services Manager. The Services Manager has got few key important roles that it plays, the foremost among them being the policy management and authoring capability. So you basically write your policies using what we call the policy editor. It's a web-based application framework that gives you good UI-based way of writing policies. You can also then use the Axiomatics Services Manager to manage the domains. Domains are what we call the group of policy decision points that we club together to push and deploy policies into. And of course, it can also be used to manage attribute dictionary. So before you actually start using certain attributes in your policy editor, you need to manage them, write them, define them, and spec them out in the attribute dictionary. And of course, last but not the least, it's also used to provide mappings for attribute data retrieval from these data sources. So all the configurations needed for that, the mapping needed for that, all that is managed using the Axiomatics Services Manager. So as you can see, the Services Manager is a pretty key component, even though it is not the real-time enforcement or the evaluation component of the whole flow of the system. But without it and without the functionality it provides, it becomes a hard task to manage complex deployments, complex policies, and the complexities associated with the generic deployment of the policy server as a whole. So with that introduction for the Axiomatics Policy Server and the Services Manager specifically, let's go into the very specific topic around the webinar, which is the new feature of providing isolation at authoring and management levels. This is a new feature in Axiomatics Policy Server 6.2 release, which was done about a couple of weeks ago. And it's one of the things that we have been having a demand from a lot of our enterprise-ready customers, enterprise-level customers rather. The need basically comes from the point that large enterprises have strict need-to-know policies. So they have strict requirements on who can see what part of a specific deployment or who can see what part of a policy. For example, cases have been presented where, for example, the risk department of a financial institution could be writing policies that can be checking on the aspects related to the retail department of the bank, but the retail department's employees should not be able to see the policies that's being used by the risk department for just Chinese wall policy requirements or any other IT compliance requirements. So they require isolation at different aspects of the process. They want to make sure that policy authoring is isolated. Different people gets different views of what the policies they are writing, and the attribute definitions and what that means within the workspace has to be kept isolated from each other. The actual value of where you get the data from, maybe even the username password associated with the configuration, as well as the mapping between where you get the value and what kind of attribute you assign that to, that needs to be kept separate, as well as the policy deployments and the PDP management part of it. So you want to be able to tell customers, departments, for example, that you have this number of PDPs, evaluation engines to manage, write your own policies, deploy them, and that's going to work independent of everything else in the deployment. So that's kind of the isolation needs we have seen from customers. But at the same time, we have also heard from customers that they have no very uniform requirements about what that level of isolation abstraction layer would be. Some customers say that the requirements happen at the application level. So application A's policy writers and people who work at that level should not see application B's policies. Or sometimes it happens within department level. As I said, the risk department should not be able to see the policies associated with the other way around. Let's say the retail banking department should not be able to see policies associated with the risk department writing policies. Or it could be even geography based. European policy should not be visible from the American side of the world, or the other way around. So we see that the need for policy isolation happens for different reasons and at different levels. So the solution we have come up with involves the isolation at the Axiomatics Services Manager level. And what we call that capability is multi-project, just to keep it generic enough. As I said, it's new in version 6.2. The older versions of Axiomatics Policy Server does not have the capability, but from 6.2 onwards, we will maintain that capability. And because of the needs that we have seen from customers, the way we define project is actually kind of a loose term, because we want that project concept to be anything that the customer really wants isolation at. So if your isolation requirement is at the department level, a project can be a specific department. If you want isolation at the application level, it can be at the application level. So each application becomes a project. So a project in a way is a kind of a catch-all phrase for any kind of isolation you would expect and want from the different abstractions you have. So isolation is provided for policy library and policy authoring. So you get a workspace which is completely isolated between different projects, and each project basically has a workspace which can do everything which no other a project can have a view of. And that includes the policy library, the policy authoring capabilities, the attribute definitions, the attribute configuration from the PIPs, the deployment, as well as the PDP management. So all those things that we heard from the customers about as a requirement for isolation, from a feature point of view, we have translated that into the multi-project capability. So before I quickly go to the demo, if you have any questions, as I mentioned, please do use the Q&A bar of the tool so that you can ask questions around any of the capabilities we have mentioned. But if not, please just take a look at the demo that we are going to provide next. And what we're going to do next is quickly take you through the different views that you would expect when you use the Axiomatics Services Manager in 6.2. What we will start off with is an admin view of basically managing this capability. So you will see how an administrator can create projects, create users, and assign users to those projects. And that's the first part of the demo. And in the second part of the demo, one of those users, we'll create two projects, project 1 and project 2, create two users, user 1 and user 2. And then we will basically log in as user 1, do certain functions, certain actions, for example, create some attributes, use them in a policy, and then we will log out. And we will log in as user 2, and we'll see that all the things that user 1 did is no longer visible for user 2 because user 2 is in project 2, and user 2 then gets a completely different set of things to manage all by themselves. So let me just quickly go through the demo to give you an idea of what I'm talking about. So here is the Axiomatics Services Manager, the ASM. Let's just log in as admin. And then at the admin level, you get to have this bar which says this user has not been assigned to any project. It's a fresh install, which means the admin user has a kind of a user base, but the user then itself hasn't been assigned to a project, and it's not compulsory. You could have an admin account who is not associated with any project, or if you say that it's a very simple install, I just want a single project, I am the admin and I am the overall in charge of everything, you can get started with that. But let's just take it one at a time. I'll go to the admin interface and go to the point where I get to see all the projects that's listed. By default, there is one project. We just call it project 1. You are more than welcome to change it if you want it to something else, but let's just look at project 1. So if you want, you can change the name there. What I'm going to do next is I'm going to create another project. Let's call it project 2. Let's put a space there as well. I'm just going to not create any members to it right now. I'm just going to apply to it. So what that does now is that the Axiomatics Services Manager will now create two projects, will have two projects, project 1 and project 2, each having nothing else, no services associated with it. By services, we basically mean the PDP, the policy decision point, and no members right now associated with it. So I'm just going to cancel out of it. Go into the user management view, and here you can see there is an admin user who you are basically. So if you click here, you can actually see who you are right now. You're the admin, you're not associated with any projects right now for now. So just what I'm going to do now is I'm going to create two users. Let's call the first one user 1, and login name as user1. And there I'm going to associate user1 with project1. Add it. There are two possible permissions you can give to a specific person added to a project, a read-only mode or a all mode. All means he has got full rights and accesses to all the different capabilities of the services manager, so define attributes, use them in the policies and so on. Read-only mode just gives him the ability to browse through all the things that's available in the project. So I'm going to just make him all. And I'm going to create another user. Let's call him user2 and associate him or her with project number 2. Again, I'm going to add all permission to that user as well. So right now I have two projects, project 1 and project 2, two practical users, ignoring admin user, user 1 and user 2, each one of them assigned to project 1 and project 2 respectively. So that's the only thing I will do from the admin console. I'm not going to use the admin console to do anything else. You can, of course, create deployments. So what would happen is when you associate PDPs, the policy decision points, with this services manager, it will get listed on all the different places here. So every time you create a new policy decision point, register it to the ASM, it gets listed out here. And at that point, when you go to the project setup, let's say project 1 here, you can basically pick and choose all the policies you want associated with a specific project and add it to that project. And that basically means that if there are 5 PDPs, you can assign those PDPs to, in this case, any of the 2 projects you have at the administration point. As you can see, this view of managing users, managing projects, and managing services is only available to an administrator. The actual user of the project gets the view that's only for composing policies and deploying them. So let me just go out, log myself out, and log in as user 1. Hopefully that shouldn't be a problem. So you can see now that I've logged in as user 1 and user 1 is given access to project 1. And what I will now do is just to give you a kind of a taste of what isolation looks like, I'm just going to create a simple attribute. Let's call it user 1 attribute, just for lack of a better name. Access subject, I'm just going to say created by user 1. I'm going to fill in some sane values for each one of them, the typical values, most of the cases actually. So you can see now that in the access subject, there is a new attribute called user1 attribute, and then I can use that within a policy. Let's go to a policy management window. Let's create a new policy package, and you can open, so as you can see this new policy package last edited by user1, and you can open that and start using it within the confines of workspace for project 1. So here, as you can see, you can just create something here. So I'm not going to go into the details of what this policy editor looks like and what it can do, but I'm just going to just for the sake of distinguishing between what it looks like here and maybe in the next project, I'm just going to add some descriptions there. So as you can see, you get all the views for somebody who has been used to the Axiomatics Services Manager from before. You get all the things that you would expect from the Services Manager, but within the confines of Project 1. So that's because User 1 is associated with Project 1. Now let me just go ahead and log myself out from Project 1 as a User 1 and log myself in as User 2. And as you can see, when I log in myself as user 2, because user 2 is assigned to project 2, that you can see out here, you get a completely different view of, isolated view in this case, of the services manager. You wouldn't have anything that user 1 had performed in the project 1 workspace. So the attribute that user 1 created does not exist here. The policy package that user 1 created does not exist here. So all those things that user 1 did is completely isolated in project 1 workspace, and that's why we call it multi-project. So here I could do exactly similar kind of thing. I create a new attribute. Let's say user 2 attribute, put it in the namespace of access subject, category being access subject again, this being string. So as before, now you see that you have a user2 attribute, which is different from the user1 attribute that you saw before. And if I had deployed policies, you would have been able to look at all the different policies that's associated with that project here. In this case, I don't have anything right now because it's a very simple demo I want to show. But the idea behind this is you start writing your policies using the dictionary attributes that you have defined here. You go start writing your attribute policies here. And then when it's time to actually deploy these policies, you go into the domain. The list of all the PDPs associated with the project gets available here. You can then actually classify them into domains and then deploy policies into that domain. So you get to manage PDPs independent of all the other PDPs which are available to other services. So you get a clear, filtered, isolated view of all the things you would expect to do in the services manager. So that kind of brings me to a end of the very short and sweet, hopefully, webinar content, where we first started off with the ABAC and the general description of attribute-based access control, moved on to the policy, Axiomatics policy server, and the main functionality we introduced in the policy server, which is the multi-project capability. And then last but not the least, we went through a quick demo of what that actually means when you manage policies, manage attributes, and also from an administrator point of view, when you create new users, associated them with projects, and when you start writing, when you start deploying more services and PDPs, you would be able to manage them in a similar way as well. So sorry for the kind of a constant talk, but now I guess it's a good time to open the floor for questions. So.
Yes, we have some great questions that have come in, Srijit. So some of this will be a little bit repetitive, but the questions came in as you were talking about it. So I'm going to go ahead and ask them again,
Sure.
just to make sure everyone got the specific details. So a quick question, actually, you just ended on this. Is it possible to isolate deployment from policy authoring?
So right now, we do not have that, I would say, separation of duty concern within the view of a project. So if a user is associated with a project and is given, say, full administrative capability, so for full access, not just read-only, he or she can do everything that's associated with that deployment. So you can write policies, you can deploy policies, you can you cannot remove services from the project, but you can deploy and write policies. We do have in the roadmap and the backlog the ability to separate out those concerns. So just where you saw the user being able to either have a read-only access or full access, we are planning on introducing more kind of clear demarcation between somebody being able to just compose policies but do nothing else, and somebody being able to, say, deploy those policies but not write policies. So that's going to come, but later on.
Okay, excellent. Okay, so we did have a quick granular question about the demo you were going through. So as the administrator is going through and creating new users, so the admin is going to create user one, then how does the password get created for user one? Are they queued up to do that on their own, or is the administrator setting all of that on their behalf?
Right, so that's very similar to what we have in the Services Manager right now. It's a web application containers property. So Axiomatics Services Manager, it's a web application, Java web application. So it runs within a container like Tomcat and WebSpheres. And traditionally, and we continue with that, we assume that the user profile is kind of defined outside the web application within the container level. So you basically, I don't have the view right now, but basically at the back end, let's say in the Tomcat user XML file, you would basically associate a user, its password, and a specific generic right associated with that user. So that assumes then that you wouldn't have to specify the username and password at the user management level, but also more importantly, if you have an enterprise which uses something like LDAP directories and so on, you can basically integrate the web application container user management with your existing Active Directory or LDAP directory user management. So you wouldn't have to manage passwords at all. You can do other authentication setups which the web container supports.
Very good. Very good. Okay. So the individual users, can they be added to multiple projects?
In the current version, we have a one-to-one mapping. If that's one of the requirements you have, please do let us know, because our kind of requirement gathering process gave us the kind of a strong hint that people don't have that as a clear requirement. Most of the time, they want to keep it separate, so they have people who don't want to be able to link to the two different projects. So in the first iteration of this feature, we have kept them separate. So if you're part of project one, that's what you will see. Later on, if there is a demand, we can of course implement one-to-many mapping between user and projects.
Okay. Very good. So here's just, I think, a clarification question from one of the attendees. So let's say we have 5 product lines that require different access controls in our company. So to clarify, then we could create 5 separate projects for these 5 product lines.
That's right.
Okay.
Yes, you can. Yeah.
Okay. Very good. Okay. So what if I want to provide the ability to isolate policy editing to the policy authors, but I want to combine all the policies created in the isolated environment into a single policy package for deployment into a PDP domain? What does that look like?
Right. So it's actually one of those, I would say, differing from the norm kind of use case, but it's one of the things we have talked about as well. So one thing that we have clearly tried not to do in the Axiomatics Services Manager for now is to be able to kind of capture all the complex workflows that might be associated with enterprise deployment models. So this is one example of it, where you say you want to have separation of policy writing process, but you want to deploy all of these policies, combining them into a big super policy package and then deploying into one single policy PDP. So it's enterprise level stuff. So the way we want to do that is to be able to tell customers, right, use this workspace concept, multi-project concept, or do isolated policy writing, and then use the APIs and some of the scripts that we can provide to customers to pull out the policies from the project views and then combine them offline, not within their services manager, but in a scripted kind of malleable manner, and then use that, again, APIs to deploy things into the domains and PDPs. So half the thing gets done as a part of the policy writing process within the services manager, but the other half, where everything kind of gets combined and gets deployed, it shouldn't require human intervention, and that should be done at the API level.
Okay. Okay, very good. So here's a question about workflow. So if you have different teams, would you expect them to each have their own PDP?
That's true. Right now, we have the notion of having multi-project within only the ASM, which means each project would have one or more PDPs associated with it, and you would deploy your policies into the PDP. That's the typical deployment model we have seen. We do have in the backend, in the backlog of our product development, the concept of extending multi-project into the PDP, where you can say a single PDP deployment would be able to service multiple endpoints. So a single web app can have multiple endpoints, each one of them for, in this case, a specific team. But we haven't come to that point yet, just because it's a slow iteration and we are looking at the market demand for such a feature. So if that's one of the core things that whoever asked the question is interested in, please do get back to us so we can kind of gather requirements and then move that production along.
Yeah, great. Yes, and if any of you have questions after the fact, you can always send them to our general web email, which is webinfo@axiomatics.com, and we will make sure they get routed to the right person. In this case, probably Sridhar, to answer. So,
Sure thing.
okay, so a couple of general questions came up too around when you were talking just about ABAC and policy creation in general. So I'm going to ask you a couple of these more general questions here. So is it possible to define enterprise policies and then reuse them within a given project or even across projects?
Right. So I'm guessing what the question meant about enterprise policies, I'm guessing is that you have a kind of an enterprise level policy which is a cross application or cross department, pan application and pan department, let's put it that way. And then you have application specific policies and you want to combine them. So you want to reuse the pan application, pan deployment policies or the pan enterprise level policies, irrespective of which application you are in. So the easiest way to do that in the current setup is to kind of going back to the answer I gave about combining the policies into a big package would be to use a similar approach. So you write your application specific policies within these workspaces, and then one of the projects that you would define would be for this enterprise level policy, and then you create them separately, write them separately, manage them separately. But when it comes to the deployment point, you kind of offline, with not within the services manager but outside it, you start combining them in such a way that all the enterprise level policy gets evaluated first, and there is a hierarchy to do that, and we can define that. And once that's it's evaluated, you kind of branch into each application specific policies. So it's another, I would say, workflow kind of requirement. The services manager right now is not meant to do that, and we expect the customers to use the powerful APIs we have to do that.
Okay, very good. So is there any limit to the number of policies and attributes in a single project or even across a deployment of APS?
No, there's no theoretical limit. Practically, of course, you will be limited by the, I would say, the memory and the CPU cores and all that you would have from an evaluation point of view. But none of our customers have hit a limit, and there is no limit that we have within the product itself.
Okay, excellent. So I do have a version-specific question here. Is it possible going from version 6.2 and into the future to not use this functionality? Is there a way to work without using this feature?
So the 6.2.0 version does not have the option of switching it off, and we have heard from a couple of our customers that that might be an interesting thing for them to have. So we are looking into providing that kind of a switch where the administrator, when he first logs in, can say, oh, I want to disable projects completely, multi-project capability completely, and then going forward, then you basically will be able to switch it off, and then what you get from a view is what you would have from service APS 6.1 or anything before that. So yeah, right, 6.2.0, the current version does not support it, but going forward we will have that in place.
Okay, very good. So one last question here is somebody is curious about they typically have the Axiomatics policy server in place, and they're interested in how they could go about trying this new feature. Any suggestions on that?
Sure. I think the most ideal and the efficient way would be to get in touch with either your account manager or your technical lead manager from the customer relations team, and they'll be happy to take you through the demo that we have done, or a more complicated one, help you get started and migrating from one version to the other. Or if you decide after looking at it quickly that you're not, it's not a critical part of your upgrade path for now, you can just stay with what it is now. Or if you're saying that, oh, this is a real cool feature which my policy, my auditors and compliance people will really like, you're more than welcome to upgrade and then start using it in your environment as well.
Okay.
So talk to the sales representative or the technical representative from Axiomatics, and they'll help you.
Okay. Okay. Very good, Srijit. Well, I think we're through all the questions here. Is there anything else that you would add before we close out?
No, I think so. Hopefully, we have given you a quick taste of what multi-project does. It's the initial days of multi-project. So if you have questions around it, if you have feature requests around it, or if you have suggestions on how to make it better from the way you would use it in your enterprise, we are you're more than welcome to share that with us, and we are looking forward to feedback.
Very good. So again, if anyone has questions or feedback, and you want to send an email, you can use the general web info at axiomatics.com address, and we will get back to you very quickly on that one. And we look forward to hearing your questions and again, hopefully seeing you at another webinar in the future. And Srijit, thanks so much for a great session today.